Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and across America, the battle continues. Who's going to pay for the state, municipal, federal deficit crisis? Well, the city of New Haven has a novel idea. Maybe not so novel, but at any rate, here's the idea. Privatize the custodial services in public schools. The janitors that clean the schools up now make about $20.90 an hour. So how about we privatize it and pay them $12.50 an hour? And that's called efficiency. Jeannette Wicks-Lim is an assistant research professor at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and she recently did a study looking at just what these cuts would mean, both in terms of cutting the deficit and what it means to the families involved. Thanks for joining us, Jeannette.
Sure.
So what did you find? First of all, what's the plan? Why do they want to do it, and what are the consequences?
Well, the idea behind privatizing the custodial services for the New Haven public schools is, just as you said in the lead, the city saying that they want to find ways to cut the budget deficit, and one way to do that is to privatize these services. What's being considered right now is having a private firm, GCA Services Group, take over the custodial services that's currently done by city employees. And one of the things that this does is it drastically cuts the pay and basically eliminates the benefits for most of the workers that would be working as custodians in the schools.
So first of all, what's the size of the municipal deficit, and how much dent would this make in the deficit if they do it?
At the time of writing this report, the deficit, the annual deficit for the city, was projected to be about $42 million. This has been revised downward because of the Connecticut state budget has been announced, and now it's about $22 million. So, in the original report, I note that the savings that the city would expect from going to this private contract for these custodial services would represent about 19% of the deficit, so a pretty good chunk of it. Now that the deficit is now estimated at $22 million, it's about 36% of the deficit that would be cut back by doing these, or moving to this private firm for the services. Now, this just gives you a sense of how large the cuts are to the pay and benefits of these workers, because if you consider the fact that they're coming from lower to income working households, and they're being asked to take about a third, more than a third, of the burden of the city's deficit. And this represents about, these workers that are currently doing custodial services, is about 186 workers. That represents about less than half of 1% of all the households in New Haven.
So the point here is less than half of 1% of all the households in New Haven are paying more than a third of the taking care of a third of the municipal deficit.
Exactly, exactly.
So lead us through again a little more. What do the workers do, and how much are they getting paid, and what will they end up with if this privatization goes through?
Sure. Okay, so these are the custodians. Anybody who has school-aged children, runs into custodians in their public schools all the time. These are the people who make sure that the hallways are clean, that the cafeterias are, cleaned properly, that maintain the basic quality of the building. So you just think of them as the caretakers of the physical learning environment for these kids in school. It also includes, groundskeepers, people who are doing some automechanical work. But again, basically these are the people who are taking care of the physical environment at these learning institutions. So the basic changes are this. The average wage currently for the custodians is $20.90. Under the privatized contract, this average wage would fall to $12.50. So it's a cut in wages by about 40%. In terms of benefits, one of the really significant changes is that right now the custodians work full-time. The entire workforce is working full-time. Under the privatized contract, about 2/3 of the positions would be part-time. It could be more than that. I had to estimate this a little bit, but at minimum 2/3 of the positions would be part-time. And all those part-time workers would have no health benefits and no retirement benefits. The current full-time workforce has both of those benefits, health and retirement. So these are not only drastic changes in terms of compensation, but also in terms of the work hours, so the potential earnings. So the amount of, at a very much lower pay rate, they're working about half the hours.
A part-time job at $12.50 an hour without benefits, one would assume, is going to be a much more transient workforce. People are going to come and go. So how much interaction do these custodians have with the kids, and how stable is the workforce that's there now?
Right. Well, these custodians are working in the school building throughout the day and during, evening activities. These custodians interact with the kids all the time. Again, if anybody has a school-age child, knows that when you go into a building, you're going to run into custodians. And I know from my own personal experience, my son, knows some of the custodians in his school by a first-name basis because he interacts with them so frequently. In terms of their tenure, one of the things that I found to be a significant characteristic of the current workforce is that the custodians in the New Haven public schools average about 10 years of job tenure. So they've been working at the same job for about 10 years on average. If you look at custodians nationally, what their job tenure is, it's 4 years. So this is a huge difference in terms of the number of years that you can expect a worker to stay at the job, in this custodial occupation. So I think that is something to really raise the concerns of parents of kids in school. Do you want to have a workforce that's sort of coming in and out, who are on a very regular basis interacting with your kids and taking care of their school environment? Do you want it to be a workforce that is, as you put it, transient?
Where are we at with the politics of this? Now, we should, just for transparency's sake, we should let it be known that the study you did was partly financed by the union that represents the custodial workers. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I'm very straightforward about this in the report. I say right up front that this report was done at the request of Counsel for of AFSCME, who's representing the custodians.
And what's your methodology? How do you arrive at your numbers?
This is a pretty straightforward report. It's just a matter of comparing the current contract, and so I have a copy of the current contract and then the contract proposal, the proposal that's been put forth by the GCA Services Group. And it's just a matter of very patiently and conscientiously going through and comparing wages, hours, and benefits, and then looking at some government data sources to see, the difference in workforce characteristics. I'm very careful to document all of my estimates, my data sources, my methodology, what assumptions I needed to make. Those are all documented within the report in the technical appendix.
Where are we at with the politics of this? This is a proposal in New Haven.
Right.
How does it get decided, and when might it get decided?
Well, currently the negotiations have been at kind of a standstill. Now there are going to be arbitration hearings coming up in May, and that should determine what the outcome will be. The union and the city have not been able to come to an agreement by themselves, and by the contract of the union, that requires a third-party arbitration to decide.
What exactly are they negotiating? If they're privatizing, they're essentially taking this whole sector out of the union.
Right. Well, the idea, the negotiation is whether or not the city can actually go forward with this.
But does the union have to agree, or can the city do this arbitrarily?
Well, the union can, with its current contract, try to negotiate a different contract so that the city does not go through with privatization. Now, honestly, I'm not a specialist in how labor relations work, so I don't know, how much is going to be actually negotiated in terms of can the city do it, what the terms are that would allow them to. But what I understand is that the arbitrator does want to have a sense of what the impact would be on the current workforce. So there is, part of the decision is what impact will it have, and therefore can the city privatize?
As you said, the income levels goes down by about 40%. Is there any guarantee that even if they do privatize, the current workers would be offered these jobs?
No, there's no guarantee. I mean, this is a private contract that in their proposal, the GCA Services Group say in their proposal that they'll practice preferential hiring for the current workforce, but they acknowledge in their proposal that these jobs are not jobs that are going to be desirable to the workforce. I mean, if you think about what's happening in these jobs, currently the average salary of the custodians is about $45,000. They make about another $5,000 in overtime. But when you look at what would happen under the private contract, they're talking about an annual earnings of about $13,000 for a $12.50 an hour job, 20 hours a week. I mean, the size of that loss of income is huge. So, the GCA Services Group recognizes they're going to have to put forth a huge recruiting effort to get a workforce to do these services because they can't. They assume that they will not be able to retain the current workforce, which I think is, in today's climate, you can imagine that workers will find themselves forced to take these jobs because of the high unemployment rate. On the other hand, these jobs are not going to nearly allow them to meet the basic needs of their family. So, they are really stuck in a really severely difficult situation.
And the reason this is being considered is because they don't want to consider raising taxes in any way.
Well, I have to say that I'm not sure what the actual intent of this is, because again, the cuts to these wages and benefits, and again, the hours, these jobs is so drastic. And if you think about the fact that it's basically the city saying to about 186 households that you're going to have to take on, 36% of the city's budget deficit, it seems to be about something else. This is really turning one set of jobs that basically meets families' needs and turning them into poverty, jobs with poverty level earnings, no benefits, no retirement benefits, and just earnings that a family cannot sustain itself on. So something about the severity of the cuts tells me that there's more politics to it than just trying to balance the budget. But I'm not intimately familiar with the politics in New Haven. I just know that it's striking how severe these cuts are.
Now, one of the other things you point out in the report is that these people are now going to qualify for food stamps and Medicaid. So in some ways, it actually shifts some of the costs over to the state and federal level.
Yeah, if you, again, think about what's going to be happening to these salaries, going from about $50,000 on average down to $13,000 on average. Even if you account for other household income sources, which amounts to about $18,000, you're talking about a household making about $31,000, and that qualifies them for major public subsidy programs like, as you mentioned, food stamps, which is now called SNAP, Medicaid, housing assistance, the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, child care subsidies. So in effect, these subsidy programs will be subsidizing the low earnings that these jobs will be offering under the private contract.
So just finally, the big argument for doing all this is supposed to be savings through efficiency. So if part-time workers can clean the same amount that full-time workers could, isn't that some efficiency? Right,
yeah. The mayor describes this as providing more productive services under the private contract. But one of the things I did was I carefully looked through, the number of hours that is required under the current contract with the 186 full-time workers, and then compared that to the number of hours that would be required under the private contract. And in actuality, there's basically no difference in the number of service hours. So you're not talking about doing more with fewer resources, that is fewer labor hours, but rather you're just talking about cutting pay for these workers. So there's no, in terms of the proposal, there's no indication that there's any efficiency gain.
Thanks very much for joining us, Jeannette.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And don't forget the donate buttons here, because if you don't do that, we can't do this.